Austin wants to lose weight. He selects a particular diet and checks his progress on the scale every morning. If he has lost weight, he pats himself on the back and considers the diet a smashing success. If he has gained weight, he writes it off as normal fluctuation and forgets about it. For months, he lives under the illusion that the diet is working, even though his weight remains constant. Austin is a victim of the confirmation bias, albeit a harmless form of it. The confirmation bias is the mother of all misconceptions, and it can wreak havoc in someone's life who's trying to make progress, whatever area that may be. It's the tendency to interpret new information and convert it so that it lines up with our beliefs, theories, or convictions. In other words, we filter out new information that we think contradicts our existing views. Let's look at another example. Let's say that a business team decides on, a new strategy, and the team enthusiastically celebrates any sign that the strategy is working. Wherever they look, they see very confirming evidence, while indications to the contrary remain unseen or are quickly dismissed as exceptions. Essentially, they're becoming blind to the disconfirming evidence. Astrologists and economists operate on a very similar principle. They utter, prophecies that are so vague that any event can substantiate them, such as, in the coming weeks you will experience sadness, or in the medium term, the pressure on the dollar will increase. But what is the medium term, and what will cause the dollar to depreciate? And depreciate measured against what? Gold, yen, pesos, wheat, property in Manhattan, the average price of a hot dog. Okay, so we've laid out the problem here, right? We see the dangers of this and how it can stunt growth. Okay, so what can we do about this? And for a lot of people, that's a really difficult question, because the underlying foundation of the confirmation bias is that, we are convincing ourselves that something is true. And in case I'm the only one who's noticed, we are really good at convincing ourselves that something is true. I'm going to do this really stupid thing. That sounds like a great idea. And not only that, others also know the power that this holds and choose to actually use it against us and to their advantage. Let's approach this systematically. So whenever we bump into a problem, there is a 4-step approach that we need to use. That 4-step approach is identify the problem, figure out the best course of action or the best possible solution, execute that solution, and then evaluate ways to prevent the problem from happening in the future. We've already identified the problem, that being the tendency to interpret new information so that it is compatible with our ideas, beliefs, thoughts, viewpoints, etc., aka the confirmation bias. Now let's look at what I think is the best possible solution to combat this. A very basic part of our psychology is that we are forced to establish beliefs about the world, our lives, the economy, investments, and loads of other things. We deal mostly in assumptions, and the more nebulous those assumptions are, the stronger the confirmation bias. Whether you go through life believing that people are inherently good or inherently evil, you will always find evidence to back up that viewpoint, whichever one it may be. So ideally, the best way to combat this is to take those assumptions and make them as clear as we can, and to take progress and actually make it clear and concrete and measurable. That's one of the most fundamental things about setting goals, is it has to be measurable. If you cannot measure your goal, then your goal is way too nebulous. When I was researching this topic, I found a case study that I found particularly interesting. In this case study, a professor did a little bit of an experiment with his class where he wrote out a number sequence. He wrote 2, 4, 6, and then he asked the students to give him the underlying rule of that number sequence. And they could ask, certain numbers, and they could ask, does this number fit within that rule? And he would say, it fits the rule or it does not fit the rule. So, logically it goes 2, 4, 6. Most students kept going. 8, and he would say, fits the rule. 10, fits the rule. And, just to be sure, they would keep going by 2s, 14, 16. And he would say, it fits the rule. And most of the students left it at that. They wrote that down on the paper and they turned it in. But there was one student who was absolutely not satisfied with this, who asked tons of questions, all kinds of stuff, 43, -9, 57, on and on and on and on, until he finally came to the conclusion that the underlying rule was that the number just had to be more than the previous number. The majority of the students simply tried to confirm their theory, whereas the other student tried to find problems with his theory and tried to find something that didn't work. and then worked backwards from there. And you're probably like, okay, big whoop, he was right, the other people were wrong. That's not a huge thing. But it actually is, because that's one of the most important parts in, preventing the confirmation bias. Looking for that disconfirming evidence is actually really, really important. And this comes in later with, how to prevent the problem from in the future, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So the next part is to execute the solution. The solution mostly being to clarify what we actually mean by our terms and to make it as non-nebulous as we can. In execution, this may look something, like this, where you walk up and you look at yourself in the mirror and you think, wow, I'm fat, I'm never gonna look good. Now, you see how nebulous that is? What is fat? What is looking good? So instead of walking away discouraged, figure out what you mean by that. Actually define those terms. Make that clear and not nebulous. Because if you leave it nebulous like that, you will always be right. And you may be thinking to yourself, well, if I leave it nebulous, then that means that I'm always right, and I don't really know when I fail, and people may like that. What will happen if you do that is you will fail repeatedly and you won't know it until you fail so massively that it's almost too late to come back from it. And that is really dangerous when that happens. So define what will show progress towards your goal and figure out how to get there. Make your terms as clear as possible and don't leave room for the confirmation bias. Now, how can we prevent this problem from occurring in the future? Well, the best way to do this is to keep your ears open for, very nebulous or open-ended statements. If you hear the word exceptions a lot, probably take notice of that. Often it can hide the presence of disconfirming evidence. And just like the case study with the professor and his students, looking for the disconfirming evidence is really critical. Falling for the confirmation bias is not a pretty intellectual offense. It will give you the illusion of progress without actually moving us in the direction that we need to go.